anything about your childhood that you would say set a pattern or a foundation for the work you do?
Well, I remember being interested in how things work and why things work. I remember having a lot of pets, and in particular a guinea pig named Henrietta. I was very interested in animal behavior. The University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh is one of the smaller state schools, and it was a terrific environment for me. My undergraduate experiences included research in a psychology lab, so investigating how early experiences, enriched environments influenced rats' learning and cognition and behavior. And it was really a life-changing kind of experience to try and understand how experiences and environments could affect animals' brains and biology. So that was pretty formative as well. I went to the University of Memphis graduate program where they had a very large colony of prosimian primates, so galagos, dwarf lemurs, mouse lemurs, as well as rats. So I was able to continue to try to understand how animals' environments affect their learning and cognition, but do that in other species as well, and get to learn a lot about different primates, and particularly prosimian primates, who are very interesting. Some of the work that we did was looking at sex differences in exploratory behavior, curiosity behavior. Animals learn about their environment by exploring it and by engaging in new things and acquiring information. So a lot of the work I was involved in was like open field studies or providing rats with very complex and enriched environments and looking at how that influenced their behavioral development. In bush babies, we were interested in things. At the time, people didn't think prosimian primates were curious or explored novel objects. So we did one of the first studies with my mentor, Michael Renner, who was a fabulous mentor and researcher and still a friend. So we were interested in, if you gave these, they're called bush babies, so it's a galago. If you gave them the opportunity to explore all different kinds of toys, what would they do? And what we found is they explored them, they engaged in curiosity, manipulative behaviors, and that was the first study to really show that, which obviously has some implications for both science and development, understanding species and curiosity, but also for animal welfare practices. I'm a comparative psychologist by training, so you're comparing different species. And if you're focused on things like curiosity, exploratory behavior, how does that affect the brain? Why are there individual differences? You're naturally concerned with knowing, what does the animal do? What can they do? What will they do? What do they need? So from a scientific perspective, you're interested in the animal's welfare. A lot of the work that really shaped how we build laboratory environments came from laboratory studies. So my mentor, Michael Renner, had done his PhD work at UC Berkeley in the labs of Rosenzweig, Bennett, Diamond. They were studying how enriched environments in rats changed brain growth. So literally changed the brain, circa 1960s. So that emphasis and the changes in how we treat animals, how we know about the environments mattering, really came from the scientific work that was done in those labs in the 1960s, or before I was born. My dissertation work was with chimpanzees, looking at sex differences and species differences in object manipulation. So again, trying to understand complex behaviors and learning. My postdoctoral work was in Steve Sumi and Dee Higley's lab at NIAAA, NIH Intramural. So in Poolesville, Maryland, it's a beautiful facility with big grounds and a lot of focus on how early life experiences affect development and cognition. So that kind of work was of interest to me because not only was it about how the animal, understanding basic biology, basic neurology, but it was a way to understand how genes and environments interact to change neurochemistry, to change behavior, to change lifespan health. And it's a colony of monkeys there that offers the opportunity to really look at those questions in a controlled way that you simply cannot do in humans. So we don't have that kind of experimental control in humans. So what it then lets you do is ask questions in a way that can inform human health. And that is very translational. So my interest at that point, we're focused on how do we do research that can help both animals but also humans? How can we better understand how children who grow up in different circumstances might be at more risk or might be resilient to adversity? Those are the kinds of questions we were answering and continue to answer. So very human health relevant work.
And when you do work like this in a place like Poolsville, are there a large number of people who are doing one project, or there are many people who are doing projects with the same population?
So primate research in particular is very collaborative and very multi or interdisciplinary. So when you're working with a species like monkeys or chimpanzees, you have an obligation to do the best science you can. That often means you have questions that are outside your direct expertise. So all of my mentors and in my lab now, we work with multidisciplinary teams. So we'll have people who are geneticists, molecular biologists, behaviorists, people with expertise in immunology, people with expertise in neuroanatomy. They come together and focus on the same questions. So it's a way to answer a question very effectively via teamwork or team science. And that actually is incredibly important. So you're not working in a silo, but the collaborations go beyond the scientific team. So you depend upon excellence in your animal caretakers, excellence in the people who provide veterinary care, who provide oversight. So these are large teams of people that work together to provide the best care and to facilitate the best science. But yeah, these are big groups of people. I have collaborations for decades. So you continue often to collaborate with the same groups of people. You learn new things. The field changes. So one of the things about science is you don't know what you haven't done. You learn new things and then you change. So sometimes you change your questions. Sometimes you change your hypotheses. Sometimes it becomes evident to you that there's some new technology or some new piece of information that you need to incorporate in order to understand the story. So if you think about it, before we knew that DNA could turn on and off, so DNA methylation, we could study genes, we could study heredity, but we couldn't study the specific mechanism by which genes were on or off, producing stuff or not. So you bring those into your new questions and you get to new places, and that never changes.
Do people all use the same population of animals, or do they have them in different places where they are?
It varies. So for primates, primates are only something like less than 0.5% of all animals in research in the US. So it's a really small number. So for rats, mice, fish, it may be a different answer, and I'll speak to the primates. So if you look at chimpanzees or you look at monkeys in academic research in the US, there tend to be large colonies and people travel to them. Or you collaborate. So if we were doing a brain imaging study, we would share those images with people at many different institutions. So you tend to study the same animals from different perspectives. It's also true that monkeys live for a long time. So the great majority of my work is non-invasive and longitudinal. So we'll study the same animals for decades. And that means a lot of different people study the same animals, but in ways that are compatible and ways where you share data across the different collaborative projects. At Wake Forest University, I joined a collaborative team, really. So there was a very large alcohol research program at Wake Forest University. And again, a big collaborative group that was focused on different levels of analysis. So people focused at very molecular levels, people focused at behavioral levels, people interested in development. So what we think now is substance abuse and alcoholism are developmental disorders. They have their roots very early in life. And if we understand that and understand early life risk factors, we can intervene earlier. We also appreciate that children and adolescents are not miniature adults. So their bodies are different, their brains are different, they're developing. So alcohol, drugs, and other substances can have different effects on them than they do on adults. So quite a bit of the work at Wake Forest was focused there on better understanding risk factors for things like alcohol abuse and drug abuse, but also understanding consequences of drugs of abuse or of alcohol. And the idea is when you have a better understanding of what happens in the brain, what happens in the body, what sets you up in terms of risk, you can develop better interventions and better treatments. And also inform the public so they can make better decisions. So some of the work that we did was assessing the effects of methylphenidate, so a drug like Ritalin that lots and lots of children take. Parents, physicians, public agencies had concerns about that drug, not because they thought it was acutely unsafe, but we didn't really know what happened in the long term, that those drugs have effects on neurochemistry. From the perspective of human health, we want to know that. So do they have subtle and long-lasting effects? What are they? Should we be concerned or are we okay? That's the kind of information that parents and people would like to have to inform their decisions about drugs, right? So that study is one. There, studies by other of my colleagues have done the same kind of thing for Prozac, for example, or drugs that are used to treat depression. These are disorders that have phenomenally horrible effects and produce a lot of suffering. It's good that we have pharmacotherapies that can help with those, in addition to behavioral therapies and others, but we still want to know what happens in the long term. And for human kids, it's an especially sensitive topic because, of course, we're not going to experiment with human children. So that's some of the work we were involved in at Wake Forest. And at Wake Forest, we also built a big outreach program. So we saw the value and need to communicate with our community, to share what it was we were doing, why we were doing it, and how we were doing it. So we had a team of, we had over 74 volunteers across every division. So veterinarians, researchers, care techs, who would welcome school children, who would welcome community visitors, who would welcome the media to talk about our work, learn more about it, ask us questions that we could listen to, and answer with better information than people were getting. In a democracy, the public ultimately makes decisions about what happens and doesn't happen. So the public can decide, okay, we're not going to do animal research. That could happen. I feel like if the public is making those decisions, they should have the best information they can to inform them. And when I looked around at that time and look around now, I see so many campaigns and so many groups that are contributing to public perceptions on the issue, but not always representing the full range of how the work's done, why it's done, what would happen if we didn't do it, and the kinds of moral dilemmas that we wrestle with. So I think it's important to reach out to the public, provide information, and then welcome people to share with us the moral responsibility to decide what to do and how. So I think that's really key. It's only going to become more key. We're up against a lot of forces that I think want to drive towards a particular agenda, ending animal research, for example, without really telling the public what that would mean. And I think scientists are good people to share back with the public because they have that information and they can best project what would happen if we don't do the work and what kinds of consequences there would be ultimately. I think the public is concerned with medical and scientific progress. So learning new things that help us better manage our lives, better manage the environment, better manage things for the animals themselves. So I think they have all of those interests. Children and child health tends to be a particular interest, but so is non-human animal health. And we can see that in the US in terms of how people treat pets, right? So there's a lot of concern there. The public has an interest in the animals being treated well. They have an interest in the progress. And I think the best way to reach out is not necessarily to focus on a specific issue or a specific population that benefits, but to show the full range and say, these are all the different reasons. You cannot easily disentangle these things. So one of the two examples that I'll talk about a lot with the public is the discovery of serotonin, okay? So serotonin is a brain chemical. It's one that most people know about. It's involved in a lot of mental health issues. It's a target for a lot of drug treatments for kids, adults, and for other animals. How was it discovered? Well, over a 45-year time period, beginning in like the 1930s, there was a scientist working on how blood coagulation worked. He was interested in vasoconstriction. Over 45 years, basically, serotonin was discovered, synthesized. People figured out it was in brain. People in the 1960s said, wow, it's involved in mental health. So it's involved in psychosis, which meant then you had an understanding that let you develop drugs. But it let you do so many different things, and it wasn't predictable at the outset, right? At all. So that guy, he wasn't thinking, I'm going to come up with a cure for depression. I don't think. I don't know for sure. But he was interested in how vasoconstriction works. That's how science works. So saying that everything's a one-for-one or we're doing a project just to fix this one thing, I think conveys a false impression of how science works. And I think that in itself contributes to huge problems in misunderstanding and then in decision-making. The other example I use now a lot is Ebola. So let's think about Ebola. Let's think about what it's doing in Africa to human populations. Let's also think about what it's doing to wild apes. So in 2006, thousands of gorillas died. They're highly, highly endangered from Ebola. So we have human populations, we have ape populations. We want a vaccine for Ebola for a lot of reasons, right? How do we get there? Well, some of how we're getting there is based in biomedical research conducted in the US by multidisciplinary teams using captive populations of chimpanzees and of monkeys. So you now have a moral dilemma. Do you want the vaccine? And what happens if you don't get it? And whose interests are being protected if you don't do the work? And you can see really easily it's very complicated, right? What's the answer is something the public has to decide. That one also gets you into the global views. So science doesn't have borders, right? And the idea of who decides. So those are the kinds of approaches I take. Not so much let's focus on one disease or one population or one country, but let's talk more generally. One of the, I think, issues that should be getting a lot more attention, and I don't think really is getting attention, is who should decide. So the US funds and conducts a great deal of the world's science, right? Which means it's happening in our borders and it's our democratic decision about what to do and not do, how to regulate it, what to put off limits. But in reality, our decisions have consequences for other nations, for other people, and for the world population that benefits from medical breakthroughs. I don't think we have a good answer for that. So we see continuing out what people will call outsourcing or movement of research from one country to another. So we see a greater development of primate research in Asia, for example. We see that some of that happens when one country changes their laws or increases regulatory burden or responds to activism that results in threats and harassment, right? So is that a good thing? I don't know the answer. I have my own viewpoint, but I don't think we have enough attention to the issue. Similarly, we often heard in the chimpanzee decisions in the last few years, the US is one of only 2 countries that do chimpanzees research. That's actually not true. So European scientists do their work here with US populations of chimps. Canadian companies were contracting with US labs to do their work here. The science actually doesn't have borders, so it goes everywhere. So who decides becomes a question that I think we need to grapple with and discuss more. So who's at the table? Who's at the table at this meeting? Who's at the table when we have international conversations about research? Those are complicated. I focus on the chimpanzee situation because I think it's one of the current and best examples. And what we've seen there is the work move to here. I think with monkey work, we may be seeing it increasingly moving to Asia. The venue in which that conversation occurs, I don't know. I think There are differences between countries, between cultures in terms of transparency and in terms of values. And what seems to be the case right now is there are scientific meetings, international scientific meetings, where the scientific results are shared. There is an increasing move by groups like ALAC to do global programs, but those aren't really the same thing as having a concerted effort on what's the best path forward and how can we organize it? Can we organize it? Within 20 to 30 years in the US, the only chimpanzees that'll be left are those in zoos, for example. Is that a good thing? The US used to provide some of the only stable resources for chimpanzee research, behavioral research. We won't have that anymore. Does that matter? Those are the kinds of questions I don't see a venue for people to discuss, and I don't know what it means. There are groups that oppose laboratory animal research, absolutely. Groups that oppose it in smaller ways or ways that are harder to identify. Several of those have made it absolutely clear that they would like to see the chimpanzee decision process move to other primates. I think that's been said publicly in a number of different venues. So the question for me becomes, was the chimpanzee research evaluation process the right one? So what did we learn from that? Were things left out? Was there a better way to do it? What was the end result? So if we're going to, I think inevitably we will have those discussions. I think we should reflect and say, was that the best way to do it? Are there different ways to do it? Who wasn't at that table? And did that matter? What's the ultimate consequence? Does that matter? So more discussion, I think, is a good idea. But it could be rats, mice, and birds too, right? So why do we distinguish between them becomes a question. Should we? How should we?
What do you think?
Personally, I think that we should be really clear about why and how we distinguish between them. So there's something called graded moral status. We don't treat bugs the same way we treat chimpanzees. Why? What criteria are we using? So we're typically relying, from a scientific perspective, on complex cognitive abilities, the ability to plan for the future, the ability to remember a past. Does that occur or not? But also we talk about rights and responsibilities. So we have a moral obligation to care about animals suffering, period, whatever the animal is. In addition to that, we have an obligation to think about weighing the different interests and to think about that in terms of what other species' capacities are. So the capacities of a chimpanzee are different than the capacities of a worm. But I think we need to be upfront about what those differentiations are. And I will say there are some groups that don't see a differentiation at all. So PETA, for example, is really upfront about that. They see all animals as the same and think they should all have exactly the same rights. Question is, should they have the same responsibilities too? So, we in general don't hold chimpanzees responsible for their actions in the way that we hold humans responsible for their actions, right? Why is that? Well, because we have the capacity to engage as partners in a moral community in a way that we don't expect other animals to. So that kind of conversation would be, I think, one that needs to be had. But people need to be really clear about what they actually are proposing in their positions. And I think groups that oppose animal research are differently transparent about that. So PETA is absolutely transparent. Other groups, Humane Society of the US, not as transparent. I'm not sure what their positions are. And it's really important to know what those are so that you can have a dialogue and move forward. So you will sometimes see someone who is very behaviorally oriented appear not to support work that is more molecular or that might be invasive. And I think that sometimes is problematic because the public will see a scientist as an expert. So you can say, I'm a primatologist. Well, I am a primatologist. So are many people. We have different expertise. So when someone who has less expertise on molecular or neurochemical or on pharmacological fronts comments on that work, I think they need to be clear about what they know about it and don't. And I think that's a public responsibility. So some of the work that can be under attack is invasive work. And people say, well, we don't need that work. You say, well, why don't we need that work? How is it we came to understand how the brain functions, how genes turn on and off? That was through invasive work, no doubt about it. So I think it's a little disingenuous and at best to behave as though behavior will get us everywhere. It won't. We need all of it. We need the behavior, we need the neural work. And some of it is invasive. The Ebola stuff I talked about, behaviorists are not going to produce an Ebola vaccine. They may, however, be the people who are able to figure out how to administer it to wild apes. So you need both sets of expertise and you need respect for both sets of expertise. But most of all, you need people to be really clear about what they know and what they don't know. So in addition to doing outreach and engaging with the community at large on what kind of research we do, we also need in-reach. So veterinarians are typically not trained in behavior. Behaviorists are typically not trained to do open heart surgery. So you need both things, but they need to learn about each other's work so they understand the constraints. Same thing with behavior and neural people or any of the subsets of disciplines. So education goes beyond just talking to the public. It's talking to your colleagues. Wisconsin was coming home for me, and I was delighted to do that. It has changed my research in a number of ways. So at Wake Forest, I was in a medical school. The University of Wisconsin is a large undergraduate institution, and one of the things that I'm thrilled to be able to do is actually be in the classroom and offer a lot more undergraduate research opportunities. So I have a lab with many undergraduates from freshman to senior working on projects that build their ability to do research and build their education. That's one of the strengths of the UW, which means what you do evolves a bit with student interest. And I try to facilitate their development within the overall mission of my work and provide them with opportunities. At the same time, one of my longstanding interests has been in animal welfare, though from the perspective of how do environments matter, how do animals' cognitive opportunities matter, how does that change brain and behavior. What I realized in the past several years is we need far more evidence and empirical study driving our policies and practices, and there was really a gap. So some of my current research has shifted course somewhat to focus on providing data, actual data and theoretical models that can be used to guide policy and practice and promote animal welfare that balances the animal's welfare with good science. And as part of that, I've developed an interest in the much bigger picture. So psychological science comparative psychology really, has always guided our care and treatment of captive animals outside the laboratory. So if you look at Harry Harlow's work nobody ever thinks about this, but in the 1950s and 60s, much of it actually drove better practices in zoos and in other settings that house primates. Similarly, the work that is done in chimpanzee centers, that is done in laboratories throughout the country by comparative psychologists or psychological scientists, drives practices in zoos, in sanctuaries, in all the settings in which animals live. But what I realized, and it was kind of funny, is the regulatory system actually doesn't track that at all. So this is a project I've been working on over the past year and have become increasingly interested in, is understanding how policy and standards for animals outside labs work and how we can use science to drive better policies and practices outside laboratories and for captive primates more generally. So we call it the Equity Project. And our first goal was figuring out, well, what are the rules for these other settings? What does regulation say? What are people doing? What are community practices? So we know a lot about how other labs work, how other research facilities work, but much less about how zoos, sanctuaries, entertainment, breeders, dealers, pet owners work.
Are there regulations?
Yeah, so a paper I just wrote is now online, and this is exactly what the topic is. It was realizing I didn't really know. So I did a systematic comparison just for primates, and it turns out that there are some aspects of there are differences according to purpose. So the way our regulatory system works is pretty interesting. We don't have a set of regulations that apply to all chimpanzees in the US. We have regulations that are purpose-driven. So if a chimpanzee were in publicly funded research, then we have a high level of federal regulation, of standards of care, of transparency, of public input. On the other hand, you can have in some states a chimpanzee who is privately owned by an individual and virtually no rules apply. Right. So you're surprised, as I was. I was like, wait, what? So, I sat down and I actually made a table and did quite a bit of research trying to better understand how does this work. So zoos and sanctuaries fall under different rules. Anybody who has a primate that the public might have contact with is required to be licensed by the USDA. Research facilities are registered with the USDA. The USDA rules apply to both then. For research facilities, especially if they're publicly funded, NIH has another layer of regulation. Those facilities may also be accredited with ALAC, and so on and so forth. So there's a high level of regulation. A sanctuary could choose to be licensed by the USDA or not. So there are sanctuaries that have monkeys and they're not licensed. They're not regulated by federal rules in any way. They may choose to have some kind of voluntary accreditation, which is terrific, but that's not a public thing, right? So that's a different set of constraints, different set of rules altogether. And the American Society of Primatologists, which I've been a member of for a long time, actually has about a 20-year-old position statement on that, opposing private ownership of primates. And it's because I think experts believe that people in general are not well equipped to provide for the care and safety of something like a chimpanzee. So that's the Equity Project. I have several undergraduates who we've been sending out requests, I think, to about 90 facilities at this point. So we looked at as many zoos, large, small, private, research facilities, private, public, sanctuaries, private entertainers, breeders. So we used the USDA registry. We used the internet and identified different facilities, selected a small sample. And then what we did is we reached out for a very simple thing, which is under USDA rules, all facilities that house primates have to have a non-human primate environmental enrichment plan. It's a rule. So we just reached out to people and said, would you share that with us? And our goal there was twofold. One was to learn, what are people doing, what's it look like, because we don't know. But the other was, what we have found in research facilities is people exceed the regulation by a lot. So if you said, we just do what's required, that's not true. We go well beyond that. And we know that the standards are often performance standards, so you can't really say this is what happens or doesn't. There's a lot of flexibility, which means there's flexibility for people to go way beyond. So the second part of our goal was to get an idea of what the community standard was. So what are people really doing? And what's working for people, what's not working, what looks like it's a good practice that actually perhaps should be part of the regulation. So is there evidence to support a practice? Is it actually beneficial for the animals? Is it commonly used? Well, it would seem like a pretty good candidate for a policy change, right? So that's the approach. That's a long haul approach. But the understanding part is first. And the first thing that happens is we learn not everybody wants to share. So it's not been an easy thing. We had a lot of luck with research facilities, a little less with some of the others, and that's probably about building trust too. One of the ultimate goals that I'd hoped for is by interacting with these different people, different groups, different kinds of facilities, it can be a two-way sharing, right? So some of those places are not necessarily fans of laboratory research at all. And an increasing, something I've seen is sometimes people from sanctuaries, for example, signing on to petitions against lab work. And I often wonder if they really know about lab work and how it actually works, why we do it, how it's regulated. So some back and forth there, I think, would be really effective and important. The blog is Speaking of Research, and it was started by Americans for Medical Progress and Jackie Calnan, who have a phenomenal program called the HAIR Fellows. So it's a peer advocacy program, and I'm a huge fan. I think it's one of the best programs out there. So their inaugural HAIR Fellow was Tom Holder, who is now with Understanding Animal Research in the UK. I'm sorry I blocked. It's been, I think, 6 years I've been working with Speaking of Research. So Tom was a student, I believe, at the time. He was very interested. He's not a scientist. But he was very interested in what was happening in Oxford and in the UK in terms of animal rights activists waging some pretty serious campaigns. So as a HAIR Fellow, Tom came over to share some of the protest movement from the UK with the US. And what he did is he set up Speaking of Research as an advocacy group, I think by himself to begin with AMP's support and help, and set up a news blog. So the point at which I got involved was, I think it must have been around 2007, when some of our colleagues at UCLA were under attack by some extremist groups that were doing Molotov cocktails, lit someone's car on fire. And so there was a lot going on in the US, and I think people were really concerned. So I started working with Speaking of Research at that point, and one of the things I loved is the blog actually provides a way to reach anybody who has access to the internet. So I've done a lot of face-to-face outreach, and I still do. But that doesn't reach the kid in Nebraska who wants to write a term paper on animal research. And that kid may not be able to find good sources. So if you look around, you see there are a fair number of static web pages that provide pretty dry information. There really wasn't a venue for scientists and others to engage very thoughtfully in current issues, have back and forth, and provide the public with solid information on current events. So that's what the blog does. And I like it because of the reach and the interaction. So we're an international group at this point. So we have scientists, we have policy people, we have communicators, and we don't always agree on everything. But we can provide some international perspective and also very quickly, I mean, within hours, comment on issues or provide counterpoint if we don't feel like the whole story is being told. And the whole story is almost never told, so that becomes really important. And we offer a place for scientists to talk. So we have a guest blog series, and we've had a pretty good success in providing scientists with an easy venue to talk about their work at a lay level. So people guest blog maybe 1,500 words. They can share their research with a larger public, and it tends to be a pretty easy way for them to do so. We will allow just about any comment. We do have a policy. If people are engaging in threatening or abusive language or something that is beyond disagreement, we'll remind them that we have a commenting policy. So that's not okay. And people comment as they're able. So I wish I had more time to comment. I don't. I'm running a lab, I'm teaching, I have a lot of commitments. I can't comment on the internet all day. My contribution can be often a blog post and some commenting, but different people weigh in and provide commentary, and we really haven't had many problems. There are political campaigns, huge political campaigns by groups that are opposed to animal research. One of the responses I think that has happened, I'm not sure about this, but my perception is institutions, maybe even agencies over the last 30 years have responded to that by thinking if we simply have more rules and more administrators and more compliance people and more boxes to check and more everything, that will fix the problem. But it won't fix the problem. It won't even come close, because those political campaigns are about ending animal research. They're not about doing it better, and they're not about animal welfare. So you look at that and you say, okay, does it serve the animals? So we fill out a metric ton of paperwork, and it slows down the research, it increases cost. That may be okay if it achieves a goal, but does it? Do we have measures that show us whether it's effective for the animals or the science? Do we have measures that show us what it actually costs, right? So when you take someone's time from one thing, it's not going somewhere else. So if it takes hundreds of hours to get something done that is not the science, then what was it for and was it worth it? I don't think we have enough focus on that, and I think we've built an industry around compliance. The question to me is whether it's time for some pretty self-critical evaluation of what that is accomplishing. What I'm afraid of is what we're going to see instead is a trend towards more and more and more. And that is something that is a problem. Because you know what will happen? The work will go places where that isn't a problem. And then you're going to ask some other questions about the science, about animal welfare, about American enterprise, about American scientists. I'm an American scientist, so I'll focus there. So that's a big trend. The other trend that worries me is we are setting up a system where science funding is decreasing. There are a lot of pressures on public institutions. There are a lot of pressures on scientists. So we don't have a lot of extra time. People want scientists, and we'll see it at this conference, everybody would like scientists to defend science and be out there doing outreach. They also want the scientists to fill out a lot of paperwork. They also want the scientists to figure out how to make better animal welfare. There are some natural limits. And scientists often, surprisingly, are not at the tables where those decisions are made. That seems problematic from the teamwork collaborative perspective. And then the final one is this idea that there are any neutral conveners of anything. So nobody's neutral. People benefit from science, and when science involves animal research, they're benefiting from animal research. They are not neutral, right? So I think we need some better thought about why are we polarizing? Why are we saying that there's animal researchers on the one hand, scientists on the one hand, animal rights people on the other, and there's some happy middle ground full of neutral public people? That's just not right. Actually, the first time I came to Primer, I was at Wake Forest. I'm sorry. I came to Primer once a long time ago and then came back over the last 3 years. So the first time I came was one of our IACUC administrators invited me to present some of our work on, we were working on a project to provide bedding for primates in pen housing, which was something I had wanted and needed to convey to the folks making decisions. So I did a full-out project. It took a while. Published the results. So Dave Lyons at Wake Forest asked me to share some of that work and some of what we were calling evidence-based enrichment. Primer has folks come from IACUCs and they go back to their institutions and convey information. And they also provide a forum, or try to provide a forum, where they are trying to represent different points of view, right? I think that one of the points of view that could be represented better is the idea that regulation isn't everything, compliance isn't everything, and ethics isn't just about justifying the science. It's also about thinking about fundamental positions. So what's the harm of inaction? What happens if we don't do science? What are the implications of these campaigns against science? What are the implications of having more and more and more compliance? So actually addressing some of the issues that may not appear to be directly relevant to IACUC, but in fact are the bigger, broader, larger questions that most certainly are, right? So the primer is public responsibility. So inviting the public might be a good thing. So I'm not sure about this and don't want to be unfair, but I'm not really sure there's much public here. So, where are the college students? Where are the high school students? Are their voices being heard? Which public voices are being heard here? Because if we're only hearing from people who are opposed to animal research or totally focused on animal welfare, regardless of the cost to science, and then from the people in IACUC offices, we're leaving out pretty much the majority of the population, right? So I think engaging more with the actual public would be helpful, but that might be a little unfair. The other organization I do a lot more work with is the American Psychological Association's Committee on Animal Research Ethics. It's been around since 1925 working on these issues, and it's a pretty interesting piece of history that I think can inform part of this discussion. Is the reason it started in 1925 is psychologists were really concerned about how surgeons were treating animals. So they formulated guidelines, but the other thing they were concerned with is how the public understood animal research and care of animals. So the mission of care for this 100 years or so has been informing practices with scientific evidence, but also engaging the big public. Psychologists tend to be oftentimes university professors. They tend to engage with college populations. I do, right? So reaching out that way, I think, becomes important. And that's one thing I think Primer might focus on a little bit is education and inviting in some of the people who are going to become the future IACUC administrators, going to become the future IRB, future regulators, future scientists earlier on. Scientific literacy, that's a concern way, way beyond animal research, and it's one I think all of us share. We see it in the vaccines, we see it or the vaccine wars, whatever you want to call it. We see it in a lot of decision making that the public does, and we see a lot of this false balance, kind of all opinions are equal, and whoever's got the bigger microphone, the bigger budget, they might be right. We don't think that's true. So science and empiricism are a way of knowing, and I think the basic, how does a scientific method work, is probably the most important thing so far beyond animal research that we need to get across. So you form a hypothesis, you test a hypothesis, you have controls, there's a way of doing science. You might get an answer that you didn't expect, then you revise your theory, which is to the point of how come scientists change their minds? Well, if people understand how science works, they totally get that. That's why, because you don't know the answer ahead of doing the study. But if you control variables and you do something that isn't opinion-based, but actually quantitative, you can get answers. So I think people understanding that science is not the only tool we have to understand the world, but it is one of the best ones. It proves itself every single time. And it's the way that we move forward on almost every front. So I think understanding basic science is just super critical to almost every discussion, and that's got to be number one. In terms of animal research, if you then understand that there's a scientific method and controls are important, comparison groups are important, then people will understand why animal research itself is important, right? So that's, I think, really a foundational one. But then the next thing is how we actually treat animals. So most people don't know. So if you say, I work in a primate lab, they're going to have a picture in their mind. So I have a slide of this. It's what do we look like? And I did the top 10 Google hits, images for animal research. It's really ugly. So we need to get out there and say, no, this is how it works. So this is how our animals live. This is how veterinarians care for them. This is how scientists care for them. So just getting the basics out there would be important. But as you well know, there are multi-million-dollar international groups running political campaigns that seek to portray the work in a negative light. So they get one photograph out of hundreds or 30 seconds of video out of 500 hours, and they run with it. They raise money with it. They plaster it on buses, metro stations, postcards. And that's what the public sees. Those are pretty hard images to contrast with what really happens in labs, what really happens in research facilities. I'm not sure that one's winnable, but the question is, how much does scientific literacy shape animal research attitudes? And we don't have good data on that. We know that support from the very, very few studies that have been done, we know support for animal research is higher in people with a college degree, higher in people who have scientific coursework. That's what we know. But beyond that, we don't know a lot. I think that when you, and I encourage my colleagues to think this way too, you can't look out there and say everyone opposed to animal research is opposed for the same reason and is the same person. They're not. So there are a lot of different reasons to be opposed to animal research. Some of the folks are probably anti-science. Some of the folks may be opposed on moral grounds that they've thought all the way through, and they believe that humans are not more important than other animals, that there's no reason to ever involve animals in any human activity. I think that viewpoint's problematic because it also doesn't tell us what to do to help animals. Back to the Ebola vaccine, like what? So it's it's the idea that passivity or inaction has no harm. It does. There are people that would support the research if they thought the animals were well cared for, and they don't really know. So there are all different constituencies. I don't think it's all scientific illiteracy, right? Probably not even close, but I don't really know. That's why we need the data. I think the idea that we have really important global decisions to make in partnership with a pretty diverse constituency, and I think all of us need to be clear that just focusing on regulation or just focusing on one aspect of the puzzle isn't going to prepare us or help us to partner in answering much bigger questions. And I think we also owe that to our students and our kids and the next generation, is rather than continuing to build a very polarized, very narrowly focused system, we really need to do the hard work, the very hard work of talking about the big picture and the big issues, and considering that no one's neutral in this.